If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Forbidden Religions, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. Back in the day when Onyx Path Publishing dealt with the vast majority of Vampire the Masquerade books in the 21st century, they would start the development of their books through the means of a site called Kickstarter, a global crowdfunding platform focused on creativity. In short, fans of the material would invest in products they wanted, rather than being ham-fisted, tone-deaf ones. Anyway, one of these crowdfunded books was Cults of the Blood Gods, a Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition sourcebook that introduced and expanded upon various mortal and vampiric cults, as well as rules and mechanics for playing the Western necromantic clans and bloodlines in the 5th Edition setting, comprising of the Giovanni, the Cappadocians/Harbingers of Skulls, the Lamia, the Samedi, and Nagaraja, collectively known as the Hakata. It was a very successful Kickstarter project. It reached its initial goal of $30,000 within an hour of going live, surpassing $100,000 in under 2 weeks and finishing with over $150,000 raised. 16 stretch goals were reached, in addition to increasing the overall art budget as well as bonuses for the writers. 3 of those stretch goals were supplement books that expanded upon the material in Cult of the Blood Gods, which you can purchase and include in your stories right now. The third and final of these was Forbidden Religions, previously named Forbidden Faiths, which I honestly feel was a slightly better title both narratively and for alliterative reasons. Forbidden Religions was released on the 26th of January 2022 and serves as a supplementary Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition book that expands on the content presented in Cult of the Blood Gods. It is highly likely that if you are a fan of Cult of the Blood Gods and the material in that book, this has gotten you all excited, arousing the blood as it were, probably dying to know what sort of things you can find inside, but before we do that, here are the rules for the Lore by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they're presented and easily they're conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book made out of that slightly squishy cardboard material, meaning it will mark easily. That said, it is currently free from said creases, at least my copy is, despite the countless times I have read through this book, and even if it did mark in this manner, that would not bother me too much, but I know that sort of thing will annoy people. My solution to this is to purchase the PDF copy. The cover of the book are somewhat familiar in design to that of its parent book, Cults of the Blood Gods. Bloody vampires on the front, with the unique Onyx Path lifelike graphic novel aesthetic on the back to the left, with easy-to-read text on the back to the right. The front cover of the book uses the same sort of style with some sort of bloody sacrifice going on, literally. It's a very intense and yet very serious piece, with the cultists distracted by something, staring at the reader like they are an intruder, seeing and learning things most forbidden. Of course, this may not be the narrative here. It could be them, the cultists, seeking some sort of approval from whoever's in charge. Regardless of narrative, whilst it is a very striking and effective image, the interesting shades of green and that gives the ongoing practices a more alien feel, adding to the aura of mystery. I have to say that this isn't my favourite VTM cover done by Onyx Path, partly due to my own biases on the art style, and partly because I am not fond of the piece itself. This perhaps more reserved front cover contrasts with the more angry and almost revolutionary piece at the back, lifting a more dramatic scene from one of the cults that I will explore later in this review. It has a very different style to the front, a painting yes, but not as photogenic as the front. Most of the art found within the book follows the traditional Onyx Path style, which I naturally find to be a mixed bag due to my own preferences, most of which dominate the lore sheet towards the back of the book, and the page spreads it at the beginning of each chapter. The art in this book is perhaps the most striking and intense of the 3 stretch goal V5 cult books, producing illustrations I would argue were very much picturesque and very close to the main V5 style, while still pertaining their own unique style, which I ultimately prefer. I'm particularly fond of the pieces on pages 30, 33, 40, 64, and 84. When you open the book and read the riveting short story that introduces some of the cults found within the book, you are greeted with the standard White Wolf / World of Darkness introductory chapter that details what the book aims to cover and what you will find inside. The book poetically unveils the 3 broad categories and the many cults within this book falls into. You have the worship of Methuselah that both they and their adherents that fight for power, the search for Golconda and the many awful forms it could take, the search for oblivion and death, not the discipline or wraith kind, but the absolute end and the pursuit of more diabolical practices. There are also the standard lore sheets and the advantages section, all of which will be explored and discussed in grander detail. Each chapter starts with a short intro, explaining the types of cults that the chapter of the book will unpack and then describe each cult in turn. It starts with their origins, what kickstarted the cult into action so to speak, and their cultures and behaviours in the modern nights. Some of the cults have their own dedicated temples somewhere in the world, which is more beneficial for storytellers, while some have unique discipline powers or amalgams, which are more useful for players. My favourite sections of each of these portions are the perspective and story hooks paragraphs. Starting with the former, each cult is presented a stereotypical view of the 2 playable sects in V5, the Anarchs and Camarilla, and then some other cults and/or clans, depending on the cult in question. Older fans of VTM may feel slightly nostalgic here, as it is very similar to the stereotypical views of the clans and sects you would find in the character creation chapters of old. Storyhooks presents the few ideas on how to introduce the cult in a game, either as a player character or NPC, to create some interesting plot points. What I love about these points is just how accessible it makes these cults in your games. They are all fairly complex, most rich in lore that is either brand new to V5 or developing and moving forward older material with a new bloody coat of paint, so having some handy pointers to guide newer / less experienced players include these ideas in ways that feels organic rather than leaving it all to the imagination. Chapter 1, titled Pathways to Power, focuses on the Methuselah cults that are focused on the conquest of power, focusing on clans Vendru, Nosferatu, the Banu Hakim or Assamites, and Tremere. The first of these, the Shattered Spear, is a Vendru-focused cult that worship the Methuselah and ancient Sparta goddess Artemis Orthia, who fell at the Battle of Carthage whilst fighting evil, making these blue bloods the only ones more saltier about the events of Carthage than the Bruja. They fight and push back demon worshippers and diabolists, never shying away from the face of battle. Whilst I'm very active about my disdain for the Vendru, who I personally find to be very boring, I do love this cult more than most in this book, as they feel more akin to the Vendru of the Dark Ages and Sabbat. They are more active and vocal in their leadership roles, taking up sword and arm, but with a more heretical twist presented here. The second cult are the Withered Ones, which are the Nosferatu that hunt other Nosferatu, which are kinda but not really the Nictuku that I referenced in my review of Children of the Blood, whilst enforcing the use of masks in their culture, as hinted in V20 Dark Ages. Now, it should be stated they are not the bloodline, but emulating the Nictuku myth, to quote the book. These Nosferatu wish to appease the Nictuku and hopefully keep them at bay. Whilst it is upsetting not to see this developed into a proper bloodline, not having the Withered Ones attached to the Nictuku proper gives the concept a lot more freedom to make them more interesting, adding some substance beyond existing just to kill the Nosferatu. Not much, but there is some. This decision makes sense to me, as the Nictuku have always been somewhat of a cult. Whilst there is some better direction on how one could use them in-game, as the storyteller, I am still unconvinced how a player would commit to such a role, particularly if there is a Nosferatu in the coterie, their emphasis on diablerie, and the more humane-focused V5 this book supports. That said, it does encourage some very creative convictions for players to conjure, should they wish to attempt to make their Nosferatu angrier than a long-term coke addict. The Cult of Power number 3 are the Shepherds of Ul Shagir, which, to bastardize rather poorly, brings a lot of the borderline extremist Assamite traditions of old into V5, including the laws of Hakim that they chose to spread by travelling across the world. Those they deem unworthy are brought to justice, by which I mean are killed. I was initially excited by this. I am not the biggest Assamite fan, but I am a huge Shagir fan, just for the amount of power and authority he holds, not just over the Assamites, but the world of darkness in general. It was also exciting to see those more familiar pieces of Assamite lore I know and love return, as their development into V5 was very minimal, and with the unlikely development of the Ashira that ally with the Camarilla, it is nice to see someone caring for the Banu Hakim / Assamites and their lore here. However, it is fair for me to say that while some of that history and culture is presented, not a lot is actually developed. It to me felt for the most part more like a simple, here's that info you wanted kiddos, have fun. The convictions box, and indeed the cult as a whole, is just a very interesting retelling of the path of enlightenment, the path of blood, which kinda makes me question the direction and application of this cult in games with V5 players. Players' own convictions can make this easier to manage, sure, but the paths of enlightenment are not the path of humanity, and it's difficult to read this and think that any character concept following this hasn't given up their concept of their degrading humanity. There is also a fair amount of conflict with Shagir's involvement here that confuses various elements of the grander metaplot. It doesn't make sense to me that he would awake from torpor, kneecap the Tremere blood curse placed upon the clan, and then fuck off to search for greater power. It seems a little odd. His departure also preceded the fall of Alamat, as mentioned in the V5 Sabbat book, a change I'm still very salty about because it doesn't make sense as to why such an event could even occur and why he wouldn't just goatsy the entire Sabbat operation. Oh yes, 'cause fuck you. That's why. But having thought it out, I can only come up with one strangely specific example of how any of this could work. The Assamites not wanting to worship Hakim or be converted to their way of thinking or to be killed. 12 Ancillae of considerable age, to quote the book, i.e. elders, to recruit potential members or kill them. Without the use of phones or tech, this is left to recruiting thin blood vampires want to become one of the elusive 13th generation because most other vampires are not stupid enough to believe these hyperbolic beliefs. Confused yet? Good, then you understand how daft this all is. Finally, there is the Presidium, a cult of Tremere dedicated to the legacy of their founder, aiming to keep the clan relevant after the destruction of the Viana Chantry. Whilst an interesting group of Tremere, they ultimately feel more like an extreme bunch belonging to House Tremere, the Camarilla-aligned loyalists of the Pyramid, led by Karl Schrecht. That said, I do like the fact that the Presidium offers themselves as a better alternative to the Assamites, which is for anyone wanting to break from the traditional stereotypical Tremere concept we've all seen time and time again. Chapter 2, titled Dreams of Golconda, presents cults of completely different sets of natures to the first chapter. They have different takes on salvation or mastery over the vampiric form. Again, 4 cults are presented, this time moving away from individual clans. The Children of Salvation believe that vampirism is a demonic infestation that should be exorcised through the means of diablerie, never refusing the chance to hunt. There isn't a lot to say about this one that hasn't already been said in my review of the V5 Sabbat book, for this seems very similar to the write-up to the Path of Cain in there, and just like that, I'm not a huge fan of the focus on diablerie and how one-note this all appears to be. That said, the story hook suggestions for this cult are some of the more interesting in the book, particularly the I was a vampire once idea, as something so sweet, almost nostalgic, emanates from something so inhumane. On the flip side to this are the Butterflies, who see vampirism as an eventual transcendence, which has a very strong US family Christian cult feel, fit with all the glooming undertones but with a vampiric twist. A Toreador allegedly accomplishing Golconda, leaving the cult's direction to her ghoul Joseph, is a very interesting narrative. It puts the Toreador in a godlike status, putting the cult's existence in a weirdly modern spin on such an ancient practice. I wasn't sure on the choice choice of name to begin with. Yes, Golconda is a metamorphosis of the soul, which is not the most clever metaphor in the world, but Blanca, the aforementioned Toreador, doesn't appear to be that bright either. She is/was obsessed with it, and, in true Toreador fashion, gave something quite unpleasant and a more wholesome and artistic touch. The more one reads into this, the more creepy it gets. The third cult, the Eremite, is perhaps the closest to Golconda if you were to interpret it in its most severe format. Kindred of this faith seek enlightenment through isolation and starvation and are thus almost impossible to run as player characters, unless said game is a solo game as suggested in the book itself in a little box on page 41. That said, it does encourage the players to be creative if they want to make the concept work, which is the detail I like, unlike some of the more recent Renegade V5 books. This book puts in more effort for their players and fans, but regarding the cult itself, it is probably one of my favourites in this book because of the hard-hitting imagery and writing throughout, removing any notion that the road of Golconda is always a peaceful one, like you're some holier-than-thou figure. I also admire how there are some of this cult that are not there willingly, and also find its interpretations of Golconda fascinating, as its constant denial of tyranny of the beast is a contrast to what an actual journey to Golconda entails, if we were to use the standard core book definitions. The fascination of poles, columns and pillars amongst them is an odd detail not fully explained, but interesting all the same. Finally, you have the Hunters of the Golden Cicada, a cult of kindred in Shang-Qing that actively seek Golconda through charity and benevolence by aiding mortals in need. They believe it is their duty to use their blood to do so. It has a very strange Children of Osiris vibe because whilst arguably the most humane of the bloodlines, their path is not one of Golconda, as I described on my lore episode about them, which you can check at your own leisure. It also seems strange to me that this cult and the rest of the kindred of the megacity of Changqing only learned of Golconda half a century ago, given the idea originates of them and the Kuei Jin that dominate East Asia, which are referenced here. It seems a bit weird to me overall. I also forgot this one existed when I was reviewing this book, so take that how you will. Following this is Chapter 3, titled Eschatological Thought, which is probably something I've pronounced horribly wrong, so fuck yourself, you crybabies that get wound up that I pronounced vicissitude 3 years ago. Probably petty sabs aside, the cults found in this chapter are obsessed with the end times. Each of these cults has either legitimate or fabricated beliefs to fuel their gains and motives. The first cult, the Whisperers of the Dead, are made up of the newest and youngest members of the Hakata clans and bloodlines, primarily the Cappadocians and Harbingers of Skull/Ashur, wishing to gain favour of the Kapujin, the Cappadocian/Harbingers of Skull/Ashur, running the ship as it were. They are the true ones, and they listen to the Speaker, who has direct contact with the Kapujin. They do not follow the Hakata into the modern nights, but march to the beat of their own drum as it were. The reality is that it's really run by a bitter Harbinger, jealous of his clan weakness, the ghostly Palor, not being present on the newer Hakata and wishing to use them to fuel his jealous needs. As much as I like the concept and how, in true Cappadocian seneschal fashion, this Cappadocian is truly fucking with them around them with tainted whispers, it suffers a similar problem to the Shepherds of Earl Shaggy by presenting an option for players who want to be one of the Hakata but not attached to any of the sects. At least this one isn't confusing and does provide some interesting narratives. The second in Chapter 3 are the Orphans of Enoch, which puts another spin on Harbinger of Skull lore, this time from the Talmehe Ra perspective, or at least that was how I interpreted a cult that focused on bringing about Gehenna because they have wandered the Shadowlands and believe that is beyond the veil is ultimately better. Even the name of the cult alludes itself to the Talmehe Ra, though this cult doesn't have much to do with the Hakata otherwise. That aside, this cult is an interesting one that could be very easy to slot into any game, as any group of crazies trying to bring about the end of the world armed with the dark knowledge of vampire secrets, books and wisdom of the underworld to boot. That said, I didn't find them to be terribly deep or inspiring, or that original either. The third and last cult of the chapter also draws influence on the Book of Nod, with a direct quote on "The third day there will be silence." The cult in question is the Third Day, worship the concept of the beckoning as a holy calling, the work of some potent Methuselah, a lost antediluvian, or a feared member of the second generation. They, mostly consisting of Camarilla elders of all things, draw similarities between the visions of Auspex and Oblivion and see them as higher callings, which immediately makes it very difficult to have this as a player option. I do like it that there is some description about the beckoning feels like to kindred, which is as varied as the summons themselves, which simultaneously is helpful and redundant. It is also frustrating it is such a small addition to a tiny sourcebook. The final cult-orientated chapter is called Ruinous Beliefs, which contains what some would dub diabolical cults. Cults that are more likely to be used as antagonistic fashions in your V5 games. To start us off, we have the Bloodless Pilgrims, who have claimed to have found an alternative to drinking blood. All you need is a special ritual and an unconscious human to kill and a load of messed up cultic shit that I think would be better for you to read in full. What seems too good to be true is very much the case here, particularly when you read up the cult's leader, a caitiff called Benedict Hutter, whose write-up takes up most of the section regarding the cult. The Children of the Devourer is cult number 2, and this follows the village cult in the woods somewhere trope, but surrounds it with the gangrel and a sleeping Methuselah, which I personally feel would be very fun to run from a mortal perspective or a nomadic anarch coterie. A whole chronicle could be spent interacting with the locals and uncovering the secrets of the secluded village, trying not to piss off the gangrel that are oddly close to their Dark Ages equivalents, or perhaps join them in their style of existence. Probably one of the harder ones to start off in my opinion, but definitely one of the more entertaining ones here. The penultimate cult of the chapter is the Penny Dining Club. A group of snobby British male ancillary from the Bullington Club started a fine dining club with weird, exotic foods and interesting use of thaumaturgy. It stretches the concept of a cult quite far, but it is a particularly messed up club, as anything regarding blood sorcery tends to be. The menu art is particularly delectable and a lovely addition that one could use as a prop in game. Whilst I personally struggle to see how a player could make this work long term in a chronicle, given one location for the club is in Oxford and the other travels in a global pop-up cafe fashion, such mobility would potentially make an interesting chapter in one's ongoing chronicle. I'm reminded of the Midnight Circus here. The final cult of the entire book are the Soldiers of the Adversary, who believe the biblical end times are now and are preparing kindred for the coming events, whatever that may entail, worshipping Satan and embracing their inner beast, reveling in their vampiric natures, choosing to corrupt over killing your fellow kindred. A very strong and edgy entry. It immediately falls apart when I tell you it all started following an acid trip. I had already lost interest in this point, but your experience may vary. However, reading this, readers that have played older versions of VTM will immediately know this whole thing is a stand-in for the Bali. Reading a bit more, the kindred running the cult, a bruiser called Santiago Molinero, is the puppet for an Anazir who, after curious readers put the name into the White Wolf wiki and reading he belongs to an old bloodline long believed to be destroyed, to quote the V5 book we're talking about, will discover Anazir is a Bali. Oh, how some things never change. But interestingly frustrating Easter eggs aside, it is no secret that the Bali was straight up vetoed from V5, i.e. made forbidden by Paradox Interactive. Yet it baffles me how this cult made its way in here, especially with the artwork on page 81, which is reused on the back cover. I wish to point out that I personally have no problem with this. Whilst I believe the likes of Consent Sheet Session Zeros and the whole shebang are very important, I did a whole episode on this, Vampire the Masquerade is a game for adults. I, like some of its readers, am mature and sensible enough of a person to not feel influenced by this book, to not start practicing devil worship and satanic rituals in real life because some edgy vampires in a fictional setting does this. Various VTM books have included the Bali by name and expressed the difficulties of playing them, best leaving them as NPCs. In short, this cult's existence, specifically in V5, seems very weird to me, though I can admire this seemingly odd form of protest from the Onyx Path writers here. It was, after all, their last V5 book to date, so what better way to do it than to flick the lion's nutsack? The fifth and final chapter of the book is probably what players rushed for first, which is the bit with all the powers and crunch, and by powers I actually mean merits and flaws, for there are no discipline powers in this chapter, as some are scattered about the book proper. Whilst we're on this topic, I have deliberately not touched upon them because I personally do not care for them. I don't get excited for Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness in general for a host of powers and rare items and artifacts, despite their persistence of them in later Sabbated SI books, but I digress. These merits and flaws coincide with the different cults mentioned in Forbidden Religions, all of which add some unique flavour to your cultic vampire, though I do feel that some of these should have belonged in Cults of the Blood Gods proper. I am particularly fond of Semblance of the Methuselah, for it encourages outside research, embellishing one's appreciation for older editions of vampire. On the topic of integrating lore into sessions, the book ends with 6 lore sheets using materials found within the book, my personal favourites being the last 2 lore sheets, which you can find for yourself. If you have loved the Cult of the Blood Gods material up to this point, Forbidden Religions is a thought-provoking book that inspired me throughout, filling me with much intrigue. It was actually difficult to stop reading at times. There have been so many books like this for VTM in the past, and this well-written book fits and feels part of an older yet similar style of book whilst belonging to the V5 style, which is just as important. Despite this, I couldn't help but feel that this book feels oddly tacked on, like it belongs to a different book. Cult of the Blood Gods. Bits of it were painfully average and appropriately confusing, as well as frustratingly confusing. It's a solid book that makes a great addition to your V5 collection, and I do highly recommend you getting it. Now, if I were to rank the 3 stretch goal books, Children of the Blood, Trails of Ash and Bone, and Forbidden Religions from favourite to least favourite, I would put Trails of Ash and Bone at the top, Children of the Blood at the bottom, and Forbidden Religions in the middle. Trails of Ash and Bone is the best book out of the 3, in my totally biased opinion, and the other 2 are ranked in their usefulness to me as an ST and a player. That is not to say that Children of the Blood is a bad book, but you would know that from checking out my review of said book, which you should definitely do if you haven't done so already, and the same with Trails of Ash and Bone as well. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Liturgy of the Spear out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.